"Michael, I'm outside the hospital," Elizabeth whispered, her voice barely louder than the rain. "Just for tonight. Please." But on the other end, all she heard was silence. The line didn't cut. He didn't hang up. He just didn't answer. And somehow, that silence hurt more than anything he could have said. Elizabeth stood under the flickering light above the ER entrance, her coat clinging to her body like a wet rag. Her hair, once golden, now streaked with silver and soaked to the roots, stuck to her cheeks as the rain continued to fall. She adjusted the thin scarf around her neck with her good hand. The other was cradled against her chest, wrapped in a fresh cast. The nurse had warned her not to use it, not to strain. But she hadn't asked how she was supposed to survive without two hands. Cars passed by, their headlights catching her like an animal stranded in the road. No one stopped. She slowly lowered the phone from her ear. The call was still active, but she didn't bother to speak again. She knew he was there, knew he heard her, knew he chose not to respond. She ended the call herself. A single breath escaped her lips, shaky and shallow. The kind of breath you take when you're trying not to cry in public. It wasn't the wrist that hurt. It wasn't the cold. It was the knowing that you raised someone, protected them, fed them, sacrificed for them, and they could walk past you now without even looking twice. A gust of wind swept through the lot, and she turned away from it. There was no one waiting for her, no home to go back to, no hot meal, no couch, no bed. She walked toward the bus stop like her feet weighed 50 pounds. Her shoes squelched with every step. She tried not to limp, but the pain in her side from the fall hadn't faded. She remembered a time, years ago, when Michael had fallen off his bike and cried like the world was ending. She carried him 4 blocks home, scraped knees and all, whispering to him the whole way that everything was going to be okay. Now, she was the one bleeding, and he couldn't even offer her a hello. She boarded the bus without meeting the driver's eyes. The machine blinked red when she tapped her card. She didn't flinch. She didn't explain. The driver just sighed and waved her on. She sat at the very back. The seat was cold and smelled of mildew. She didn't care. She stared out the foggy window, watching the city pass her by like she didn't belong in it anymore. 12 years ago, she had a tiny apartment filled with warmth and clutter, and kids who still called her Mama. Now she floated through the world like a ghost, present but unseen. Her phone buzzed in her lap. For a second, she felt something, a flicker of hope. Maybe it was Michael calling back. Maybe he felt guilty, but it wasn't him. It was a low battery warning. She let the screen fade back to black and rested her head against the glass. Sarah hadn't picked up either. Neither had James. 3 kids, 3 chances. All gone. She closed her eyes and remembered Sarah's 6th birthday party, the way her daughter had twirled in a sparkly pink dress, asking Elizabeth if she looked like a princess. Elizabeth had said yes, with tears in her eyes, because she couldn't afford the dress. It had been donated by a neighbor. Now Sarah wore real diamonds, real pearls, real privilege. But the heart beneath it all had hardened into something Elizabeth didn't recognize. The bus jolted to a stop and she opened her eyes. She stood slowly, holding the rail with her good hand, and stepped out into the rain again. It hadn't let up. It was one of those soft, steady rains that never made a scene, but soaked you down to your bones. She pulled a crumpled paper from her coat pocket. Valley Grace Shelter. 1 night stay only. First come, first served. They opened at 6. It was 4:30 now. She could make it if she walked, so she started walking. Each step echoed with the silence of her children's rejection. Years ago, she used to sing them lullabies on stormy nights, stroking their hair until they fell asleep. Now the storm followed her. No one sang for her. Not anymore. The line for the shelter had already started by the time Elizabeth arrived. A dozen people stood in the drizzle, huddled under coats, plastic bags, and broken umbrellas. Most didn't speak. No one asked her name. She took her place at the end, her shoes soaked through and her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. She tried to wrap her coat tighter around her, but it made no difference. The cold was on the inside now. One man coughed into his sleeve. Another paced with a plastic bag held over his head. The woman in front of her muttered to herself as she stared at the cracked pavement. Elizabeth looked up at the church's glowing windows. Valley Grace Shelter. She'd passed it for years without ever thinking she'd end up here. She could still remember the smell of cinnamon rolls from the bakery she used to take the kids to just 2 blocks from here, back when Sunday mornings meant family breakfasts and backpacks stuffed with homework. Now they were strangers who hadn't answered a single call, not even after she fell down a flight of stairs. She looked down at her bandaged wrist, feeling the ache crawl deeper into her bones, not from the break, but from being broken by the people she gave everything to. A figure in line ahead of her collapsed suddenly. Elizabeth took a step forward, instinct moving faster than pain. A younger man reached him first. People around started shouting for help. Shelter staff rushed outside, and the doors opened early. They called out for IDs, asking who had registered in advance. Elizabeth hadn't. She wasn't on any list. They let in 7 people, 7 beds. When the doors closed again, Elizabeth was still outside. A volunteer handed her a thin blanket and said gently, "I'm sorry, we're full tonight." She nodded without speaking. Numbness wasn't new. She walked to the edge of the church steps, sat down, and draped the blanket over her shoulders. It did nothing to stop the shivering. It was the kind of shivering that came not just from the cold, but from shame. She had asked for one night, just one, and somehow it was too much for her own children, and now for the world. Across town, her daughter Sarah was hosting a dinner party. The dining room table was set with gold-rimmed plates and centerpieces made of dried hydrangeas and eucalyptus leaves. Devon raised his wine glass to make a toast. Everyone laughed, everyone clapped. Her phone was in the guest room, silent, unchecked. James was on a flight to Miami, first class. He posted a story of his meal, a shrimp cocktail with champagne. His phone was on airplane mode. Michael had just finished a business dinner. He and Jennifer were on their way home in the new Lexus SUV she insisted they lease. He turned to her and said, "I think Mum called again." Jennifer didn't look up from her phone. "She'll figure it out." Elizabeth sat on the church steps until her legs stopped shaking. She thought of the years she worked back-to-back shifts at the hospital just to pay for Michael's MCAT prep books, the time she sold her necklace, her mother's, to help Sarah pay for her bridal shower. The calls she answered when James had panic attacks in college and didn't know what to do. She had always answered. She had always shown up. But when she needed someone, really needed someone, no one was there. The ache turned sharp in her chest, and for a second she thought maybe this was it. Maybe her body would just give out here, right on the steps. Maybe someone would find her in the morning and wonder who she used to be. But she forced herself to breathe, not because she believed it would get better, just because she wasn't ready to disappear. She pulled the blanket tighter around her and leaned her head back against the stone wall behind her. If you're still watching this, if your heart is even slightly aching for this woman right now, please don't just scroll. Please subscribe, not for me, but for every unseen mother like Elizabeth who's out there right now, abandoned, invisible, forgotten. Let's not be like them. Back at Asherwood Estate, the late William Campbell's lawyer, George Ashford, sat at his desk going through a stack of final documents. He had nearly filed it away, the envelope. It was old, yellowing slightly, sealed with a wax stamp, hand-addressed to Elizabeth Campbell. He remembered her. William had spoken about her during one of their last conversations. Regret had sat heavy on the man's shoulders that day, regret and urgency. "Make sure she gets what's hers," he'd said. George had waited for the right time. Now, maybe that time had come. He picked up the envelope, stared at it a moment longer, then slid it into his briefcase. Elizabeth didn't know her life was about to change. She didn't know she wasn't a burden. She didn't know she owned every square inch of the estate her children so proudly bragged about to their friends. All she knew was that the night was getting colder, and that she was alone. Morning came slowly, the kind of grey, silent morning that didn't feel like a beginning at all, just a continuation of something heavy. Elizabeth opened her eyes to the dim light pressing through the clouds above Valley Grace. Her neck ached from the awkward position she'd slept in, curled on the stone steps. The thin blanket they'd given her was soaked through, clinging to her like a cold second skin. She sat up slowly, wincing as her wrist throbbed beneath the cast. Her shoulder cracked as she stretched. It took everything in her not to groan out loud. The street was quiet. Most of the others who didn't get a bed had already gone. Some probably to shelters farther away, some maybe to nowhere at all. She waited for the warmth of shame to hit her, like it always did in the mornings. But there was only numbness now. She had called them, all three of them, and not one had come. She reached into her coat pocket for her phone, but the screen stayed black. Dead battery. She stared at the lifeless glass for a moment, then slid it back into her pocket without a sound. She didn't know where she was going, she just knew she couldn't stay. She stood, adjusted the scarf around her neck, and started walking. Her feet moved automatically, guided by memory more than purpose. 2 blocks down, she passed the building that used to house a bakery she took the kids to every Saturday after soccer games. It was a nail salon now. She kept walking. She walked past the park, where she'd once held James's 3rd birthday party. Balloons, peanut butter sandwiches, juice boxes. He had cried when the clown didn't show up. She'd painted his face herself, pretending it was all part of the plan. He had laughed so hard, he dropped his cake. He used to look at her like she was magic. Now even his voicemail didn't have her name. Her eyes stung, but she refused to cry. Not here. Not now. Across town, Michael poured himself a 2nd cup of coffee and stared out the window of his 2-story colonial. Jennifer sat at the breakfast bar, thumbing through a home renovation magazine. She called again, he said quietly. Jennifer didn't look up. So? I don't know. She said she was outside the hospital last night. Jennifer flipped a page. Michael, you have to draw a line. Every time she hits rock bottom, she expects you to come clean up the mess. She broke her wrist. She always breaks something, she said calmly. A bone, a lease, a promise. You've done more than enough. Because part of him wanted to believe she was right, but another part of the part he kept buried under logic and pride remembered the nights his mom stayed up sewing buttons back onto his school shirts. The time she sat with him for 6 hours in the ER when he broke his collarbone falling off the monkey bars. She had always shown up, even when it cost her sleep, money, sanity. Why was it so easy now not to show up for her? He closed his eyes for a moment, then sipped his coffee. Maybe this time really would be the last. Elizabeth made it to the public library just as they opened. She slipped inside, her shoes squishing softly against the tile. The warmth inside hit her like a wave, almost painful after the chill she'd been carrying. She sat in front of a computer and plugged her phone into the charging station beside her. The screen finally lit up. 10%. That was enough. She had no new messages, no missed calls. She stared at the empty notification bar longer than she meant to. Then she opened Google again and typed, "Part-time jobs for seniors, Carmel, Indiana, emergency housing assistance, soup kitchens near me." She clicked through each one, and each one clicked back with requirements she didn't meet. ID, proof of address, recent pay stubs. She couldn't help but laugh, quietly, bitterly. How do you prove stability when the world's taken everything from you? The librarian passed behind her and gave a polite nod. Elizabeth smiled weakly in return. She wasn't ashamed anymore, just tired. James had landed in Miami. His phone buzzed as the plane taxied. He glanced at it, saw her name, and shook his head. He loved his mother, didn't he? He did. But love didn't mean always being available, not when his career was finally taking off. He'd just made senior partner. His company was flying him first class, putting him up at the Fontainebleau. He had meetings lined up with executives, and one of them might offer him a 7-figure deal. He'd call her next week, when things slowed down. At Asherwood estate, George Ashford stood outside the massive oak doors with Elizabeth's envelope in hand. He'd called twice that morning and left a voicemail with Michael's office. Still no reply. He looked down at the letter again. It felt wrong, keeping something this important in a drawer for another week. But the law required proper delivery. The beneficiaries had to be present. Still, his gut told him something was off. something he hadn't been told, something they didn't want known. He placed the envelope back into his leather briefcase and made a decision. If the family wouldn't come to the truth, maybe he'd bring the truth to the family. Elizabeth returned to the church steps that evening, not for a bed. She knew they'd be full again, but just to sit, just to exist where someone might notice her. A woman walked past holding her son's hand. The little boy looked up at Elizabeth and smiled. She smiled back. Then the mother tugged him along faster, like kindness might be contagious. She closed her eyes. She wasn't asking for miracles, just for one of them to remember who she used to be, who she still was. But maybe they never would. Maybe the world had changed, or maybe it was just them. It was the second night without a bed. Elizabeth sat on a splintered bench at the back of a park she hadn't walked through in over 20 years. Her coat, still damp, clung to her arms like regret. The bandaged wrist lay useless in her lap, throbbing quietly. The temperature had dropped. It wasn't freezing, but it hovered just low enough to make her teeth clench with every gust of wind. She knew the shelter wouldn't have space tonight either. And yet, she hadn't stopped hoping. Not for comfort, but for some kind of sign that the universe still saw her. Her phone, barely charged from the library that morning, buzzed in her pocket. She jumped. A number she didn't recognize. No name. No ID. She answered with a quiet, "Hello?" "Mrs. Campbell?" A man's voice, older, deliberate, not unkind. "Yes. My name is George Ashford. I'm the attorney for your late husband, William Campbell." She didn't breathe, not right away. "I've been trying to reach your family for some time, but I believe this is a matter best discussed directly. Are you available to meet?" Elizabeth's throat went dry. I don't understand. What is this about?" "Mrs. Campbell, your husband left something behind for you, something important." She was silent for a long time. Then softly, almost afraid of her own hope, she whispered, "I don't have a car." There was a pause on his end. "Tell me where you are. I'll come to you." 25 minutes later, a silver sedan pulled up near the park. The headlights cut through the dimness like judgment. Elizabeth stood slowly, brushing off her coat, suddenly aware of how she looked. She hadn't seen her reflection in days. She didn't need to. The man who stepped out of the car was tall, well-dressed, with a grey beard and cautious eyes. He offered her a soft smile. "Mrs. Campbell," she nodded. "Please, come in. Let's get you warm." She hesitated, then climbed in. For the first time in days, she felt heat seep into her bones. She didn't speak much on the drive, neither did he. But he did glance at her hands, at the cast, at the frayed scarf. And the silence between them was filled with more truth than either of them could say. The office was quiet when they arrived. No assistants, no secretaries, just the creak of old wood and the hum of fluorescent lights. George led her to a chair and offered her tea. She declined. From his briefcase he withdrew the sealed envelope. Wax stamped, yellowing slightly at the corners. He laid it gently in front of her. "This was handwritten by Mr. Campbell 3 weeks before he passed. It overrides all previous arrangements." She stared at it. "For legal purposes," he said, "I've already verified its authenticity. You're the primary and only beneficiary of William Campbell's personal estate." Elizabeth blinked. That estate was already passed on to Lorraine, to the children. He shook his head. "No, that was the public will. This," he tapped the envelope, "was private and binding." Her hands trembled as she picked it up. I don't understand. Why me?" George exhaled through his nose, sitting back. Because he knew what he did was wrong. Because even if it was too late to say it out loud, he wanted to make it right. She stared at the letter like it might catch fire in her hands. "I don't want the money," she said suddenly. Her voice cracked. "I just wanted my children." His gaze softened. "I believe you still do." She looked away, biting the inside of her cheek to hold herself together. He didn't press her, just waited. After a long silence, she whispered, "What happens now?" "I take you to Asherwood," he said. "It's yours, Elizabeth." She shook her head. "No," she said. "It's theirs. That's their world. I don't belong there." George didn't argue, but he didn't agree either. The next morning, the front gates of Asherwood opened for the first time in weeks. Not for Michael, not for Sarah, not for James, but for the woman they hadn't seen in 2 years. The gravel cracked under the tires as George's car pulled up the long private drive. Elizabeth's hands gripped her lap as the mansion came into view. It hadn't changed. The pillars still gleamed white. The windows still stretched from floor to ceiling. It was still the kind of house that whispered power with every brick. She stepped out slowly, heart pounding like a drum she couldn't silence. The staff at the door were expecting her. "Mrs. Campbell," the butler said, bowing slightly. "Welcome home." She wanted to laugh. She wanted to cry. She did neither. Instead, she walked across the threshold of a house she had once dusted, once cooked in, once been pushed out of. And now, it belonged to her. Halfway across the city, Michael's phone rang. He glanced down. George Ashford, voicemail 1 new message. He played it on speaker while tying his tie. "Michael, this is George. I just wanted to inform you that I've located your mother. She's been given full access to Asherwood per William's private will. Effective immediately. I suggest you call her." Michael froze. So did his breath. Back at Asherwood, Elizabeth stood in the grand hallway, surrounded by paintings and chandeliers and memories that didn't feel like hers anymore. She touched the frame of a photo near the fireplace. It was Sarah at age 4, spaghetti on her cheeks, laughing like the world was simple. Elizabeth hadn't seen that photo in over a decade, and now she was surrounded by a life she'd been cut out of, handed back not as a gift, but a test. She didn't want revenge. She didn't want to punish them. She just wanted them to remember who she was, before all the forgetting. The dining room was quiet. Elizabeth sat at the long oak table in a chair she hadn't touched in almost 15 years. A fresh cup of coffee sat in front of her. It wasn't the brand she liked, but it was hot. And in this house, that alone felt like a miracle. She wrapped her fingers around the mug, letting the heat sink into her bones. Everything inside Asherwood looked like a catalogue now. Tasteful, expensive, cold. The warmth it once had, when kids ran barefoot through the halls, when laughter spilled from the kitchen, was gone. She took a slow sip, her eyes landing on a small framed photo on the sideboard. It was James, age 10, holding up a trophy. Soccer tournament. Mud on his knees, gap in his teeth. She remembered that day. It had poured all morning, but he played anyway. Scored the winning goal. The shoes he wore had holes in them. She hadn't told him, didn't want to embarrass him. But she had saved for weeks to buy them. No one else had shown up to cheer him on, only her. And now, here she was. Sitting in the house she was never supposed to see again. Upstairs she opened the door to the bedroom she once shared with William. Everything had changed, and yet nothing had. The sheets were newer, the artwork different, but the silence, that was the same. She walked to the closet and ran her hand along the wooden edge of the door. He had been a complicated man, charming in public, sharp in private. There were good years, yes, but there were also long winters of absence, nights when she fell asleep beside an empty space, wondering where he really was. And then the affair, the new marriage, the divorce that carved her out like she was a phase. Still, in the end, he left this for her, and she didn't know how to feel about that. Grateful, betrayed, vindicated. She sank down on the edge of the bed and let herself cry for the first time since the fall. Not because of the money, not because of the house, but because of all the things she never got to say, the apologies she never heard, the versions of her story that her children would never understand, because they only knew the pieces they wanted to remember. That afternoon, a delivery van pulled up to the gate. A single envelope, thick, formal. It was an invitation. From Sarah, to a charity gala downtown, hosted by her and Devon. Elizabeth stared at it, lips parted. She hadn't heard from Sarah in over a year. And now, suddenly, A formal invite? No note, no message. Just the implication. She knew why. The papers had started to go out. News would spread soon enough. And now Sarah wanted to be seen as close again before people started asking questions. She almost tore the envelope in half. But she didn't, because somewhere buried under the weight of it all, she still wanted her daughter to look her in the eye and see her. Not the woman they pitied, not the burden they dodged, but the mother who raised her. That night she walked into the Asherwood library. The lights were dim but warm. She hadn't stepped foot in this room since the day she left. One wall was still lined with the children's books she used to read out loud on rainy afternoons. She ran her fingers along the spines. Corduroy, Charlotte's Web, Where the Red Fern Grows. She pulled one down, opened it. Inside the front cover, in sloppy 8-year-old handwriting, was a name. To Mommy. Love, Michael. I'll never leave you. Her breath hitched. She pressed the book to her chest and closed her eyes. If you've made it this far, and you're still listening to her story, don't just watch, don't be like them. Click subscribe, because stories like Elizabeth's, they're not fiction. They're happening every day, to women like her, to mothers like yours. And if this breaks your heart even a little, do something about it. Start by subscribing. The next morning, Elizabeth walked down to the kitchen and found the staff already preparing breakfast. One of them, a middle-aged woman named Patrice, gave her a soft smile. "We've missed you, Ma'am." Elizabeth blinked. "You were here back then?" "Since your boys were little. I used to sneak them cookies when they stayed home sick." Elizabeth let out a breathy laugh she didn't know she'd been holding. "I remember you," she said, voice warm and quiet. "You were always kind to me," Patrice replied, "even when the rest of this house wasn't." Elizabeth nodded slowly. The people who had the least always seemed to give the most. She sat at the counter while Patrice poured her coffee. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel like a ghost. For the first time in years, someone saw her and called her by name. That afternoon, her phone buzzed. James. She stared at the name, heart pounding. Slowly, she picked it up. "Hi, sweetheart." "Mom." His voice was tense, guarded. "I heard you're back at Asherwood." "Yes," she said. "I am." Pause. "You okay?" "I will be." Another silence. "I was going to call sooner. I know. I didn't mean for it to get like this." Elizabeth closed her eyes, letting the tears sit without falling. "I know that too." "Can I come by?" She swallowed. "Yes, you can." James arrived just after 3 in the afternoon, no call. Just the sound of tires crunching gravel and the nervous ring of the doorbell echoing through the foyer. Elizabeth opened the front door herself. For a moment, they both just stood there. He looked older, more tired than his Instagram post suggested, sharp suit, polished shoes, but his eyes were soft in a way she hadn't seen since he was a boy. The wind tousled his hair, but he didn't seem to notice. His hands were deep in his coat pockets, like they were hiding something. Shame, maybe. She didn't say anything. Just stepped back, slowly, and let the door open wider. He stepped inside, pausing in the grand hallway. "I forgot how big this place felt," he said. She nodded. "I never really forgot." They stood in silence for a beat longer than was comfortable. Then she turned, leading him toward the sitting room. She offered him tea. He said yes. Neither of them asked the obvious question. Why now? James sat across from her, shoulders hunched forward like he was preparing to be scolded. Elizabeth handed him the cup and eased into the chair opposite him. She still hadn't fully warmed up to the house again. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But this room felt smaller, more human, like something could still be salvaged here. "I didn't expect to see you," she said finally. "I didn't expect to come," he admitted. She smiled faintly. "That makes 2 of us." He looked down at his cup. "I was in Miami when you called. I saw your name. I almost answered. But you didn't." "No," he said softly. I didn't. There was no anger in her voice, just history. I didn't know about any of this, he added quickly. The inheritance, the will, I didn't know you'd be here. Elizabeth took a sip of her tea. Would it have mattered? His mouth opened, then closed again. I want to say yes, he said finally. But maybe that's not true. She nodded slowly. At least you're honest. He laughed once, quiet, bitter. Not always. But I'm trying. They sat there for almost half an hour, talking about safe things, work, weather, the way the city had changed. Then, without warning, he said, I used to think you were just tired all the time. She looked up. I thought you were just grumpy, or distracted, or overworked. I didn't know what it cost you, what you were holding together. Elizabeth didn't interrupt. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I remember one night, must have been 9 or 10, I was crying because I didn't want to sleep alone, and you'd already worked a double shift, but you stayed up with me anyway, sang to me. She smiled. You always wanted the same song. He nodded. Moon River. I don't even know where you learned it. Your grandfather used to hum it to me, in the kitchen, when he thought no one was watching. James's voice went quiet. I should have called you back. Elizabeth's throat tightened, but she held steady. I know, she said. I was scared, that I'd have to see what I'd done. You didn't do anything, James, she said gently. You just didn't do anything. That landed somewhere deep. He nodded again. Slowly this time, like he was finally letting it in. They walked the garden paths later, without jackets. The air was crisp but bearable. The leaves had started to turn, and for a moment it felt like another lifetime, before the money, just mother and son, before the distance. Elizabeth pointed out where the old swing used to hang. I pushed you on that until you were too big to fit. I was never too big, he said. You just got tired. She smiled. Probably true. He stopped walking. I don't want anything, he said. From this place, from the estate, I swear to you, I'm not here for that. I know, she said. He looked at her, eyes glassy now. I just want to know if it's too late to be your son again. She reached out with her good hand and placed it gently on his cheek. You were always my son, even when you forgot. They went back inside. She made him soup from scratch, her hands slower than they used to be, but still steady. He didn't offer to help. He just sat at the counter like he used to, watching her, learning her again. They didn't talk about Michael or Sarah. That would come later. Right now they were building a bridge, plank by painful plank, and for the first time in years it felt like something could grow again. The knock came just after 6 p.m. Elizabeth and James were finishing dinner in the kitchen. Leftover soup, warmed again, served in silence that didn't feel heavy for once. He had stayed longer than he'd planned, told her he'd cancelled his flight back to New York. She hadn't said much about that, but he'd seen it in her eyes. She was glad. But the knock changed the temperature in the room, and somehow Elizabeth already knew who it was. James opened the door. Michael stood on the porch, sharp suit, jaw tight, eyes colder than they should have been for a son. He didn't smile, didn't greet, just stepped inside like the house still belonged to him. Behind him Sarah trailed in, heels clicking against the polished tile, her arms crossed, her mouth pressed into a polite but practiced smile. Mom, Sarah said, voice clipped. We got your lawyer's message. Elizabeth stood slowly. She didn't approach, just folded her hands in front of her and waited. Michael's eyes swept the kitchen. So, it's true. James closed the door behind them and stayed quiet. You're back in the house, Michael continued. Legally. Elizabeth nodded once. Yes. And you didn't think to tell us? I tried, she said softly. Sarah scoffed. You called us at 1 a.m. from outside a hospital. That's not exactly communication. I didn't know about the will then, she replied. So you find out you're worth 200 million and you don't think that's something we should talk about? The words hit like ice. James stepped forward. No, Michael snapped. You don't get to play savior now. You ignored her just like the rest of us. Now she's sitting on a fortune and suddenly you're here, playing the good son. Elizabeth raised a hand. "Stop it. Please." But Michael wasn't finished. "I just want to understand, Mom. Are we supposed to believe you never knew? That this wasn't some long game to get us to come crawling back?" Her breath caught in her throat. "You think I planned this? You vanished for almost 2 years. I was homeless," she whispered, "sleeping in shelters, on benches. I called, I begged. You all knew." Michael's jaw tightened. Sarah looked away. "I called you from the ER," Elizabeth continued. "I had a broken wrist. I had nowhere to go. I didn't ask for money, just a place to sleep. One night..." Michael looked at the floor. James turned to him. "She's telling the truth." "And you believe that because what? You spent 2 nights here and suddenly you're an expert?" James stepped forward. "No. I believe it because I listened. You might try it sometime." Sarah rolled her eyes. "So what now, Mom? You own this house and we're what, supposed to grovel?" Elizabeth looked down. "I never wanted this house. I wanted my family." "And now that you've got the money, you don't need us anymore?" Sarah asked. Elizabeth's head snapped up. "I needed you before the money, when I was cold, hungry, ashamed. I needed you then." Michael turned away, rubbing his hands over his face. "I put you through med school," she said, her voice rising. "Do you remember that? I worked double shifts, I sold my ring, and when I had nothing left, I still found a way." Michael's lips parted, but nothing came out. "I held you through fevers, Sarah. I sewed your prom dress when we couldn't afford the one you wanted. I drove you to every dance recital, every appointment, every single time you called." Silence. Elizabeth's voice cracked. "I was there when you needed me. Every time." She took a deep breath. "But when I needed you, really needed you, none of you came." James looked down, tears stinging at the corners of his eyes. Michael's voice was quieter now. "We thought you were spiraling again." "I was," she said, "but not because I failed, because I was alone." Sarah crossed her arms again. "So what, you're just cutting us out?" Elizabeth shook her head. "I'm not cutting anyone out. I'm just tired of bleeding for people who don't notice they're holding the knife." No one spoke for a long time, then Michael stepped back. "Congratulations," he said. "You've finally got everything." He turned and walked out. Sarah followed, but before she reached the door, she paused, looking over her shoulder. "You think money makes you strong, Mom, but it just makes you cold." Elizabeth didn't reply, because she knew it wasn't the money that changed her. It was the silence. When the door closed, James sank into a chair at the kitchen table. Elizabeth stood where they left her. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stood there, holding the pieces of everything she had tried to save, and realizing she might have to let some of it go. The house was too quiet after they left. James stood in the hallway, listening to the echo of his own breath, the creak of the floor beneath his shoes. He had watched his brother walk out the same way he'd watched him walk through every milestone in life, confident, cold, always in control. But tonight, there had been something else in Michael's eyes. Not just anger, not just pride. Fear. The fear of realizing they might have lost her for real this time. Elizabeth sat on the edge of her bed, the same one she used to fold tiny socks on when her children were small. Her hands lay in her lap, motionless. She could still hear their voices in the walls, accusations, defensiveness, denial. It would have been easier if they had screamed, but it was the quiet parts that broke her, the way they looked at her, like she was some stranger who'd stolen their childhood, like the years she scraped by for them had been erased. She reached over to the nightstand and opened the drawer. Inside was the letter William had written, the one that changed everything. She unfolded it gently, reading each word again, even though she knew them by heart. It wasn't an apology, not really, just a confession, a final act of conscience from a man who never knew how to say the right things while he was alive. But still, he left her something no one else had, recognition. And right now it was the only thing anchoring her. Michael sat in his parked car 3 blocks away, staring at the dashboard. His hands clenched the steering wheel, knuckles white. Jennifer had texted twice already. Where are you? You okay? He didn't answer. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't okay. He had walked into that house prepared to confront a woman he'd decided was manipulative, unstable, and dramatic. But that wasn't who he found. He found someone small, fragile, human, someone who had been telling the truth, and it made everything worse, because if she had really been hurting, then he had really abandoned her. He rubbed a hand down his face, shame burning hot behind his eyes. He could turn around, walk back in, say something. But the pride in his chest held on like a second skin, and pride was louder than guilt, at least for now. So he started the engine and drove away. Sarah was already home, heels kicked off, earrings tossed on the kitchen counter. Devon poured her a glass of wine without asking. She didn't touch it. He watched her from across the room. Well? She's not what I expected. He raised a brow. I thought she'd be smug, smiling, holding the house over our heads, but she just looked tired. Sarah curled up on the couch, drawing her knees to her chest. She talked about my prom dress, she said quietly. Said she sewed it. Devon blinked. She did, didn't she? I forgot. He crossed the room and sat beside her. She looked at me like she'd already forgiven me, Sarah whispered, and I couldn't even say I was sorry. Devon placed a hand on hers. You still can. She didn't reply, because she didn't know if she had that kind of courage. Back at Asherwood, the sun dipped behind the trees, casting gold light across the windows. Elizabeth moved through the house slowly. Every picture frame held a ghost. Every room echoed with a version of her life that no longer existed. She paused in the hallway upstairs and opened a door she hadn't touched in years. Michael's old room. The posters were gone. The books replaced, but she could still smell the faint trace of him, the old cologne, the fabric softener she used on his sheets. She stepped inside and sat on the edge of his bed. No anger, no tears, just memory. She remembered how he used to fall asleep with a flashlight under the covers, reading medical journals like they were bedtime stories. She remembered staying up late with him the night before his first college interview, practicing answers in the kitchen while she ironed his shirt. She had been so proud, not of what he was becoming, but of who he already was. And now she didn't know if that boy even existed anymore, or if he had been replaced by a man who no longer knew what love without condition looked like. Downstairs, James cleaned the dishes. He didn't say much, just moved quietly, towel in hand, placing the bowls back in the cabinet like he'd been doing it for years. When Elizabeth joined him, he looked up. Do you think they'll come back? He asked. She paused, then answered honestly. I don't know. He nodded. I hope they do, he said. Elizabeth smiled, faint and sad. Me too. But this time she wasn't holding her breath. The morning light poured through the tall windows at Asherwood like a quiet apology. Elizabeth sat in the conservatory, wrapped in a shawl, her fingers curled around a fresh cup of tea. Her wrist had begun to heal. The bruises had faded. The silence in her chest was still there. But it no longer screamed. She watched the breeze stir the curtains, watched the autumn leaves drift across the garden. James was asleep like upstairs. Small gold regrets. He'd stayed again, third night in a row. He didn't say much these days, but he showed up, and that meant everything. Just before noon, the doorbell rang. She knew the sound now, knew it wasn't staff, knew it wasn't delivery. She stood slowly, her knees stiff from sitting too long, and made her way through the hall. When she opened the door, her breath caught. Michael. His shoulders were tense, his hands shoved into the pockets of a coat she didn't recognize. He looked like someone trying to be brave and barely pulling it off. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, I'm sorry. It came out fast, cracked, like it had been held in for too long. Elizabeth swallowed. Why are you here? He took a breath. Because I was wrong, he said. About everything. She said nothing. Just waited. I thought you were choosing misery, that you wanted pity, that it was easier for you to be the victim than to fix things. But I was wrong, you weren't choosing any of it, we were the ones choosing. He met her eyes. Choosing to stop showing up, choosing to stop remembering, choosing to forget who you were and everything you did for us. His voice broke on the last word. I'm sorry, Mom. She didn't move. For a second he thought maybe he was too late. Maybe all the doors he had closed couldn't be reopened. But then she stepped forward, and without a word she wrapped her arms around him. He flinched just for a moment, and not out of discomfort, but out of disbelief. And then he held her back, longer than he had in years. Sarah came the next day. She didn't call first, just showed up, hair pulled back, no makeup, holding a photo album she hadn't opened in over a decade. Elizabeth met her at the door, and neither said a word. They didn't need to. They sat together on the sunroom floor, knees touching, flipping through old pages. Birthday parties, soccer games, school plays, Christmas mornings, where the wrapping paper outnumbered the presents. I forgot most of this, Sarah said. You were so small, Elizabeth replied, smiling softly. You used to hide inside the laundry basket just to make me laugh. Sarah let out a quiet laugh, wiping a tear before it could fall. I don't want to forget anymore, she whispered. I want to come back. Elizabeth reached out and took her daughter's hand. You never really left, she said. You just needed to find your way home. The house wasn't full again, not in the noisy, chaotic way it had been all those years ago. But it was warmer now, softer. James stayed. Michael came on weekends. Sarah brought dinner on Wednesdays. They didn't talk about the will anymore, or the money. They just talked. They remembered. They showed up. Elizabeth's favorite chair by the fireplace became her new place. Every evening she'd sit there with a book in her lap, a blanket over her knees, and the sound of her children in the next room. No noise had ever meant more. One night James brought her a small speaker and played a song without saying a word. She closed her eyes and listened. If you're still watching this, if this story reached something inside you, don't let it end here. Subscribe, not just to this channel, but to the part of you that believes in forgiveness, the part that knows time is short, that people can change, that love, even when broken, is worth fighting for. Subscribe for the mothers who were forgotten, for the sons who came back, for the families that found their way home. Because you never know. Someone in your life might be waiting for a moment just like this one. Back in the garden, Elizabeth watched the wind play with the leaves again. She felt the sun on her face and let herself smile. She had been invisible, unheard, alone, but not anymore. She had lost so much, but she had found something even greater. Not wealth, not revenge, but presence, connection, love that had been buried, but not dead. And now it lived again, here, in this house, in this moment, and in every day still to come.